Hi, and and folks hear me? Whoops, back up a little. Don't go too fast now. Uh, I appreciate the extra few minutes here. Uh, in my presentation, I failed to mention some very important things that preceded me at Barrow, and I really like to just spend a few minutes talking about the real early days. Carl touched on some of them. He's part of that history, but there's a few other people that are, one of whom is still around, that is part of that history. And I like to just mention that uh, if not for a top secret Air Force project in the early 50s, I would not be talking to you now because I was a result of some of the activities that followed. And so I like to just back up to the early 50s. Carl already told us that he was at Barrow in 1950, uh, uh, which is certainly a monumental uh, date in our history. But my professor at Rutgers University was John Tedrow. And back in about 20 years ago, I tried to convince him to write up a story about the Air Force top secret project, which is called the Keys Project. And he finally did do that before his passing. But I'd like to mention one of his colleagues, both of Rutgers University, was John Cantlin. John is still with us, and he's part of the legacy in my mind of the early ARL days. I use ARL, not NARL, because NARL had not existed at that point. And John, I think when we look back over the survivors of those early days, I'm not too familiar, Carl, with many other folks other than you and John Cantlin, who's at Michigan State, retired as past vice president and very senior and very well-known individual in very many areas. I'm not too sure there are many of you, Carl, that are still around. You may not have known John, actually, even though you were from Minnesota. He was just next door in Michigan. But in any event, let me go on to the next slide and talk a little about the Keys Project. The Keys Project was an secret Air Force project that was just basically looking at terrain analysis using air photos, something that still is done today, but using satellites and other technologies. It was based at Boston University. It was an Air Force project. I don't think anyone can find anything about the Keys Project other than this article in Arctic, the journal Arctic, which I encouraged John Tedrow to write, and which he did reluctantly based on his own personal field notes, because there's virtually nothing available today that documents this project other than this article in Arctic. And the two individuals I'm talking about is John Cantlin in the back and John Tedrow in the foreground. Many other folks came out of this project, including Larry Bliss, who's sitting here, was one of Dwight Billings' graduate students, went on to many other tundra activities. So next slide. By the way, let me just back up and say that Keys Project was based at Umiat, but it ranged across the entire Arctic slope using weasels, the tracked vehicles that were part of the post-World War II legacy. So these folks covered the entire North Slope. It was running parallel to the USGS geological survey studies, but which are well published. However, this project has no publication other than that little note in Arctic. Next, please. So the article, without reading it, appears in the journal Arctic. It's a short article, but it certainly documents the science of the early 1950s. The folks did get to Barrow with their weasels for a short visit, but they didn't have any logistical support out of Barrow. It was being supported strictly by the Air Force, either out of one of the military bases in Alaska, directly into Umiat. Coming out of that project was John Cantlin's summary report on the vegetation of the North Slope. It's not, that again, it's not published, but it's an Arctic Institute report. And in that, he called the valley of the Colville River the Banana Belt, which I think many of you who are familiar with the North Slope know that the temperatures in the valley of the Colville Valley are fairly warmer than anywhere else on the North Slope, partly because of its topographic situation. In any event, John used that term banana belt, which many of us have used over the years. I didn't realize it was a term used in northern Michigan to describe the climate there. I thought it came out of the Russian literature, but John straightened me out after a few decades of misuse. Next, please. So moving ahead now to 1957, after telling you what the Keys Project was, here are two of the folks that were at on the Keys, John Tedrow and John Cantlin. And this is the old sign that hung over the old ARL building. And a group of us, all of us from Rutgers, were at Barrow in 1957. This is me. Two of the PhDs that had completed, that were responsible for soils work, Jim Drew, who later became the Dean of Agriculture in Fairbanks, and Lowell Douglas, the person I was working for in 1957. And Abercrombie, that was the boycott, the Barrow dog boycott. Everyone got to know Abercrombie, and the other dog was JB. Hate to go on about this, but people who are still around of that generation will know those two dogs. Next, please. So I mentioned in my talk the work that I was doing in 1957. This is right near the Orme site and the Noah site. I should say Noah site, and then later the Orme site, up on the beach ridge. And we were measuring the flux of CO2 from the soils across a moisture gradient from the very dry to the very wet. And this was all before the concerns about CO2 buildup. By the way, in those days, the CO2 concentration, the NOAA folks can check me on this, was about 280. I always remember John Kelly telling me we're wondering when we would hit 300. And I think you folks can tell when that is from the various curves. But in those days, the atmospheric CO2 was around 280, I'm pretty sure, parts per million. Next, please. I've forgotten now what the next, oh yeah. So just, you've heard a little about the old lab. And I'm not sure anyone showed the old lab. I think Craig George showed part of it in his talk the other day. But this was the old lab. The main lab was here. Administrative offices were on the top floor. These were the old Quonset huts that were put in place during the war to support the operations on the North Slope. And then this was the dormitory and the recreational room and the kind of science, get-together area. And between these two buildings was kind of a walkway, which later had a greenhouse. Max Brewer built a greenhouse in the middle. Some of the plumbing was here, the latrines. There was no running water or plumbing in those days, so there was a series of latrines, and then there were some outhouses that we used for other purposes, tea sheds. I'm not sure many people know what I'm talking about. And a bark somewhere back in here, I can't quite decide where it is, but it's there. So anyway, those of you who I believe the only building that's still there, I think it was mentioned by Richard Glenn or someone, is this building. This one is no longer there. And I spent my summer of 1957 in this lab right over here. So this is a very familiar building. Next, please. I wanted to mention in the 50s, this is what a lot of the folks looked like. We were issued the Navy clothing, and everyone wore those khakis. Usually on July 4th, there'd be a picnic that would either go down to the monument or be somewhere around the lab. This would have been the photograph taken, I believe, on a July 4th picnic day. I'm not sure of the year. I don't see myself in it, so it could predate me. This is Frank Patelkar, and this is Pete Zavala. This may be, I'm not sure. I had the name earlier today, one of the local folks. John O'Sullivan, Burrell Shanks, John Caranda, a whole bunch of folks that you won't be only names in the history. But one thing that's missing, as you probably notice, is that there are very few women. In fact, there were no women researchers at Barrow until I would say the late 60s. I believe, although I will back up and say Vera Alexander and Rita Horner from the University of Washington and then University of Alaska showed up at some point in the 60s, possibly in the early 60s. But it was a tundra biome, I believe, that broke the gender barrier. Dave and a few others can verify, and certainly Pat would if he was online. But in any event, researchers at Barrow up until the mid 60s, I would say, was predominantly men, for better or worse. And that's history is pretty well documented, I think, Dave, and a lot of what you did for the 50th anniversary volume. Next, please. And then finally, I didn't spend, my thesis was in the Brooks Range, as mentioned somewhere along the way. And so I did spend two or three summers in the Brooks Range before returning to Barrow when I was employed by Krell. And that when we started our major permafrost investigations in the 60s. But this is John Cantlin, who I mentioned earlier. He was my kind of ecological mentor. Bill Malcolm, one of his students from Michigan, were actually Rutgers at that time, and then myself. And I think someone mentioned pup tents. This was our tents when we were going out on overnight trips to cover the ground. We had no vehicles, obviously, in those days. We were put in the field in the Cessna 180s coming out of Barrow with a summer supply of pretty much for food and other things, although we'd get weekly supplies as needed. No radio contact for the entire summer. So that would have been the way research was being done in the 40s and 50s. But those were the good old days, and I think that's my last slide. And I just wanted to remember John Cantlin, and who's still there in Ann Arbor and East Lansing, and one of the early pioneers, along with John Tedrow, as part of my heritage of Barrow. Thanks very much.